Welcome to Raven Talk, the official podcast of the Raven Tribe. The Raven Tribe is a home for warriors on the path, and is dedicated to training warriors for the battlefield of life. Visit us on the web at theraventribe.com, where you can learn more information on membership, warrior training, as well as links to our official YouTube channel, Facebook group, apparel store, and our official bookstore, Marshall Books.
Welcome back, Tribe. Today we're back with special guest Mark Hatmaker. Mark was with us a few episodes ago to discuss boxing, and today we're going to be discussing wrestling, looking at a little bit of the history of wrestling as a combat sport and looking at the application of wrestling in modern world self-defense. Mark, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, brother. How about yourself?
I'm good. Glad to have you back. So, Mark.
Good to be back. Go ahead.
Great. Good to hear you. So, Mark, I wanted to ask you, just to kind of get started here, we wanted to look at wrestling, and when we're talking about wrestling, we're talking about the Western wrestling tradition, collegiate wrestling, folk, freestyle, Greco-Roman, and catch wrestling. And I was wondering if you can give us a little bit of background about wrestling as a martial culture in the United States.
Well, the United States, almost every culture has a wonderful lineage of wrestling, obviously, and as it shows up in the States, we have a long history tradition of people doing all sorts of stand-up styles, Western Cumberland wrestling. We've got all sorts of historical accounts, everyone from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln, all the way to Teddy Roosevelt and stuff. It was very, these presidents played, obviously in their younger days, with different forms of it. For the U.S., we start seeing it gets in the frontier days. We start seeing also more of the rough and tumble style as well. Some of the term is scuffling. Lots of gouging came into play. Not to say other cultures didn't have that as well, but here in the States specifically, that kind of came under the term of scuffling. And both the stand-up, as some people would start thinking of the Greco-Roman versions and the ground versions, they started, sometimes intertwining and sometimes separating out. What we wind up with when we get to the collegiate and high school freestyle tradition is really where we're seeing some of the cleaned up version, because as you know, through the 20s and 30s, we started getting a bad problem with lots of the show wrestling. Basically, that was used to kind of keep, because let's face it, some matches that are with no time limits can get boring with kind of people freezing out on positions there, so you had to start making a spectacle of it. So lots of the real shooters wanted to go off and still have some good matches going on, but also to keep competing without blowing yourself apart, because we know it's a rough and tumble sport, had to start adding a rule set. And obviously, when you start listen to schools and stuff, parents don't want to see their kids blow their shoulders and knees out so quickly. So when we see, even as rough as the freestyle in high school and collegiate is, you got to keep in mind that's still kind of a cleaned up version of it. That by no means denigrates and mitigates how ferocious those styles can be. But you basically have all the hooks pulled out of it. That is the submission holds, but you still have all the aggression, the grind, the push of it. Did I kind of get to the heart of what you were asking there?
Yes, sir. Now, I'm very interested, Mark, in this as a martial culture, especially in the United States. Mm-hmm. It's something that almost became lost as anything other than a sport. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your own research. How did you get started? Because I feel that you were on the list of, the primary instructors who are doing a, fantastic job of kind of revitalizing and maintaining Western wrestling as a real combat art instead of just like you said, the kind of cleaned up sport version. So tell me a little bit about your process. How did you begin to research it? Where did you go to learn? How are you, putting your efforts into, preserve this?
Well, I kind of fell into it. It's all complete chance, as much of life is. I have a few good wrestlers in my family. My cousin Nathan, fantastic wrestler. But also, a lot of this really comes down to my grandfather, George Washington Goins. He was a coal miner in Virginia, and apparently he did a little what they called scuffling there around the camps, which seemed to be a little mix of sometimes of the impromptu boxing and a little bit of wrestling and groundwork. And I remember him showing just me and my cousins, or the boys as we called ourselves, whether he would create a heavy bag out of a duffel bag. Of course, that's getting back towards the boxing end of it, but also just sewing some holes, a little bit of scuffling there. And it wasn't really anything thought to be special. We're not really aware that you kind of, when you're raised with that, you're thinking this is what everybody's doing. And it's not till later on you get an appreciation of going, oh, this is something a little bit different. Not that it was all lost or rediscovered. I'm saying it was just a difference in comparison to the cleaned up version. And then as I started getting older, I think I lost my grandfather at age 13 or 14. And then I think I started really just kind of go, well, okay, well, let's kind of pick up where we left off there. What resources out there kind of dovetail to what he kind of started on the path there. And keep in mind, the training from him wasn't anything really, regimented or like there was a real plan or a path to it. It's something that he kind of threw out there for us to play with. And then it wasn't until later on I realized, hey, this is a kind of a significant thing in my life. I really, really dig what's going on here. Then after that, just kind of become a scholastic archaeologist or a historian of this old stuff, and then start trying to put together what you see out there, synthesize, and trying to tear it apart, put it back together, and you figure out what did work, and what still works, and trying to resurrect where you can.
Mark, I got to ask you, because it seems like your information on wrestling and boxing is virtually limitless, and I base it on the fact that I see that you create just like an ongoing series of DVD materials and training materials,
mm-hmm.
and there's always some new drills, some new approach, and I got to be honest, a lot of guys put out a lot of content, and a lot of it's rehashed, a lot of it's just kind of revisited, and they're going to the wall one too many times. That never seems to be the case with you. So I'm wondering that you must be dipping into some great resources to find these ideas and find these drills, and I know that you kind of take a holistic approach to wrestling, and it's not just one particular style. So how do you find all this great material that you share with people?
Okay, I'm going to start out by saying that is a wonderfully humbling compliment. I really appreciate that, sir. Now on to what's going on. Yeah, I like to think if it seems like it's seemingly limitless, and I like to think that we are not scraping bottom or just repeating ourselves, and you're kind enough to say that we're not. And we kind of take pride in always trying to keep it fresh. If I've got any talent in this, and that's debatable indeed, it's as a synthesizer of information. It's being able to look at many disparate sources and be able to find where the link or the common thread is what's going on. So sometimes I can find something that might, others could as well, I have no doubt. But having so much material, having been sifted through my fingers, I'm a voracious reader and studier of this sort of thing. There might be something that might have initially struck me as a show hold. Let's say something I found in a pamphlet from 1901, let's say, and then somewhere down the road, maybe a decade later, I find this other transition from something that's seemingly completely unrelated, and then maybe another transition that I can find in an old lumberjack manual, which I have pulled some stuff from lumberjack manuals, and it's this odd, as you said, holistic or odd way to synthesize and sometimes see a connection. You go, the mechanics of this becomes this. If you link this back on here, this shoulder hole actually becomes something of significant import. We kind of change this over a little bit and put it together. I mean, there's nothing mystical to it or scientific. I think a lot of it's just the fact that I think with anybody who's doing anything, if you're doing something long enough and you're really paying attention to it and you have a passion for it, you should be able to start seeing links and systems of what's going on and never taking what you do for granted. I don't think there's a session that we have. I know at least 2 to 3 times a week, I like to take an old piece of material that I've got and look at it and say, what if this didn't exist? Or what if I'm being presented with this the first time? How would I tear it up? How would I counter it out? What would I do about it? Or sometimes that leads to nothing. Sometimes, no, that's half an ounce is about as good as it's going to get, folks. Or sometimes it becomes, this little tweak on it makes it better. And then sometimes we have material that I have to go out there with my raw crew and say, you know what, I'm nullifying this. It's out. It's gone. I no longer think this is efficacious. We've got such a simple counter to it. It needs to go out the window. So I think it's that synthesis of information and never getting bored and taking for granted what you're already doing, being willing to pull apart what's going on. I think sometimes there's a tendency to have information as received dogma that's like, this is how it's done and that's it. Maybe sometimes there's a reason for something to be done that way, and then sometimes we take a look and you go, things can be improved, and sometimes some things need to be thrown into the shit can. And I don't know if I can say that, but it's yet too late.
Mark, now let me ask you, from your perspective, you delve into these arts, these Western martial arts, specifically discussing the wrestling. there's a lot out there in the community as far as self-defense. I mean, now with the age that we live in, there's arts represented from every corner and inch of the world. Where is wrestling's place as an art of self-defense on the food chain? I mean, how do you see it? How much of it do you get behind for purely self-defense reasons, aside from supporting reasons?
Okay, and when we're talking self-defense, we're not just talking like, frat boy scuffle in a bar. We're talking, real deal, balls to the wall, save yourself.
Absolutely. Like saving self-defense, absolutely.
Gotcha. All right. Well, first and foremost, our dichotomy, our hierarchy when we're talking straight self-defense is we're the safest. I mean, despite everything that goes on in the news, it's going to pounce on it and understandably so. That's how they make their money, and things are newsworthy. In this nation that we live in, we're fortunate to live in, this is the safest it's ever been. I'm sure there's occasionally some troubling trends, but the safest it's ever been. So mainly, most of our job is all about mindsetting, preparation, prevention. If we walk through our lives, taking lock your doors, people, or pay attention when you're walking out the car. Don't text while you're driving. These should be simple things. Chances are really great that we're going to be fine. So that's number one, making sure we're aware of not just the statistical perspective of it, but the preventive maintenance of what goes on in the world. Next thing we would say is, I'm big on flight. I mean, we always hear about the fight or flight dichotomy, but it seems almost all of us, because this is where the fun, sexy stuff is. You want to take off and do the fight all the time, but seldom do you see people doing the flight aspect of it. Occasionally you might get someone give a passing nod in reference to, hey, you occasionally run some sprints, but it should be everything. It should be about, crawling from the hands and knees, up and over things out. I mean, I'm not talking straight on parkour skills, but, get adrenaline done, get people tired, make the move to give things a flight over the fight almost every time. Next, obviously, is weapons, equalizers. But when we do actually have to have confrontation, I personally, and this is a bias talking here, but I also think this is just good biomechanics behind it. I think a good solid base in boxing and wrestling is it. And even though we're seemingly just sports, having the base, the scramble, to know how to sprawl or move or evade or not be taken down in that initial tumble or scramble is huge. You don't have to, for straight self-defense, you don't have to know finishing holds. You don't need to know the escape to everything in the world is, but having a good, solid foundation of, hey, being able to stay on your feet, thwart somebody taking you down, or if you do go to the ground, understand how to get back up immediately or get back on top so you can do your ripping and tearing and gouging to get away. I think it's just a fantastic resource. So in that sense, when we do self-defense wrestling on our end of it, it's all about the ripping and tearing and the gouging. There's no finishing holds. You're not going to choke anybody. You're not going to arm bar anybody. But you do need to know how to take that high ground where you can, and wrestling can let you do that.
Now, Mark, we live in the age of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I want to get your opinion both from a self-defense and a sporting perspective. I often find it a little ironic that in the United States, you turn on your TV and everywhere you see is for lack of, I mean, it is what it is. It's a grappling art. It's a wrestling art from another country, brought from still another country. And it's the most popular thing in the world. It's all over TV. It's all over the place. Everyone wants to go and train it. And I think it's ironic because I say to myself, well, a couple generations ago, we already had that. And we already had our own wrestling. And it was probably the most popular sport in America at the time. What happened, and what are your feelings on seeing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu kind of take that place of what wrestling used to have in the United States?
Well, in one sense, the place is deservedly taken because of, a media, in one sense, media spectacle took wrestling away from our minds because the specter, no matter what you think of the entertainment value of professional wrestling as it is defined now, we all know it's a show. Despite the fact that there's no doubt there can be some great athleticism going on with it, but we all know it's a show, and that predominantly became a poor taste in the mouths of people who like a legitimate sporting competition. So in a sense, a media spectacle kind of soured the taste for many folks looking at it. And then we have a media spectacle of something like the Ultimate Fighting Championship, as it was originally called, not just UFC, comes in. You got a media spectacle that shows by, the sheer black swan event of having, Hoist Gracie come in and do so well, so dominantly, with something that was seemingly exotic to people, because most people hadn't really encountered it before. So I think it was just, spectacle replacing one spectacle. So in one sense, it was brought upon itself for the pro wrestlers, and then Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu stepped in and assumed that place. And and it's done so dominantly for so long, partly because lots of people have gone to that as opposed to just wrestling. But when we see these things matched against one another, once we see wrestlers who understand a good idea about doing some submission escapes or submission thwarting, obviously they do fantastically well against it. And at the same time, there's some great, fantastic BJJ competitors. I think in the whole scheme of things, we all come out as a net positive because we're able to look at what BJJ has added to it. And it also, in a sense, it took BJJ to remind us again, it started bringing wrestlers back to the forefront, and we started seeing Dan Severn step in. And then from then on up, how many great wrestlers have come back, legitimate wrestlers came back to the forefront of our imagination. I'm not sure that would have happened if that spectacle of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu hadn't occurred. So in a sense, we've got pro wrestling to thank for wrestling, legitimate wrestling going away to some degree, at least dropping out of our sight. And then we've got the advent of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, in a sense, to allow us to take a look at the legit source come up again. So, again, a net gain in an odd kind of zigzag fashion.
And do you think that the competition is healthy for both camps? Do you think the challenge to keep up with each other, motivates instructors and practitioners to do well with what they're working with?
I think that's a great question, and I think I'm going to split hairs on it. On one hand, sure, competition. If we think that's how whether it's free marketing, talking about pricing goods, or talking about testing ideas in the marketplace, that's a great idea. I think where I split hairs with it is like we were discussing earlier about getting too attached to a dogma. I think if we're all going to look at this as like straight self-defense, or let's say we're talking about sporting. Let's say you're doing MMA, and the first word in that is mixed. It should be mixing things up. The key for the athlete should be not going, well, how do I make this thin piece of the wedge of my dogma fit all these different circumstances? It should be, how do I take all these disparate versions of combat or sportive applications and kind of get the best mix for my own personal attributes and the sport at hand. So the competition, yeah, it's great. It gets people back into the sport. But at the same time, if we only look at it through our little narrow prism, then we might be, the individual might be limiting himself. I think in the whole overall scheme of things, it's a net gain for all of us. But if we're only trying to make my art, and that whole royally, if you're thinking, my so-and-so, you make up a martial art name and say, this works for everything. No, I don't think there's any one thing that works for everything. It should be that old picking and choosing and pulling together, the way old school boxing and wrestling, and I'm sure any martial art with its salt would be, what works, let's do it. If it doesn't work, then that's got to go away. Don't try and justify it or to say, oh, you're not good enough yet. We need to see some demonstrable returns fairly soon in the training process, or we may be playing with something that's going to disappear under stress.
Now, Mark, if a student is out there and they want to pick up, grappling skills, they want to work on a standing grappling, ground grappling game, if they're, trying to evaluate where to go, what to do, could you tell me, just from your perspective, what are some of the highlights that you're going to learn in traditional Western wrestling? Maybe some of the things that are different from, a judo class or, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class. What are the strengths of the Western style? What are some of the things that a student can, shoot for as a goal, as something they're going to pick up and be able to use as a positive in their toolbox?
That's another very good question. The answer might seem I don't think it's left field. It's not a technical aspect. I think it's a mindset. I can't think of a sport that, and so many sports train, with a grueling mindset. I can't think of a combat sport that trains with such as a grueling mindset as wrestling does. And that's saying something, because so many sports do train with a grueling mindset. So if anything, if someone's immersing themselves in the grind, as it's called, putting their hours in of running and the constant weight, hitting the weight room, and the constant time on the mat, maybe doing a single scramble again. I'm talking at high speed again and again and again and again. Yes, you're building an attribute there, but a skill, but at the same time that the old fights are won in the gym, not in the ring, or not in the cage, or getting the bell saying conditioning is your best finishing hold. I think wrestling really embodies what that principle is. It kind of gives you, even if you don't become the best wrestler on your squad, if you still embrace that grind and put your body through that conditioning. I mean, we've all had that before, where you might technically or cognitively know, in scare quotes there, more than the person you're facing. But if they are just there and their hostage just keeps coming on and on and on and on and on, there's something to be said for that kind of being able to dig deep down and go to the well many times. And you can overlay almost any skill you want on top of that. But again, if you can know everything in the world, but if you ain't got the gas or the tank or the strength, people say size and strength and size don't matter. I beg to differ. That's why there's weight classes. That's also why there's guns for the street. Size and strength can indeed matter. It's just we go to technique to help equalize to some degree, and equalize is being a relative word, because it's just, some things are like, that's pretty insurmountable. You better get a gun.
Well, Mark, speaking about insurmountable, one of the common critiques that we hear about combat sports is that there are weight classes. When you're dealing with, arts like boxing and wrestling for pure self-defense, do you have any recommendations for people to keep in mind when they're, dealing specifically with that issue? Maybe they're a smaller person and they're learning these wrestling arts. What can they do to, maximize their efficiency against larger opponents?
Oh, well, one thing is, the greater number of your sparring partners, the people you scramble with, will really help, because, how I roll with someone who's under my weight class is completely different than how I roll against my weight class and those above. So one constant being able to, test those variables, that's fantastic. Pre-things getting super regulated, I'm not just talking UFC where there's no weight classes there, but the turn of the last century where you could see more mixed matches and weight classes were more variable, and sometimes it's tossed out the window a little bit. You can see smaller men do okay. In some cases, do quite well against bigger men. In some cases, I think the victory is the fact that how long they lasted in doing well. And I think that says something for, back to your original question about how well would wrestling and boxing do in street work. Here we have two trained competitors wearing safety equipment, and some things are barred, making things last. Whenever it's the street, and you go street boxing or you go street wrestling, and then that's where a lot of the equalizers really can come into play, because ripping, gouging, and tearing, it doesn't matter how strong that eyelid is. If it's going to come off, if you stick the thumb in there. So for the ones who are just looking at the straight sport aspect, and they might be coming from a smaller weight class, well, one, you're in a sport, so that's good. You don't have to worry about fighting a guy who's 50 pounds heavier than you. But it's great to have a guy 50 pounds heavier than you are on the squad to give you a chance to play against that, alter your game a little bit so you're prepared for more contingencies.
Now, Mark, you mentioned the street grappling and looking at things like gouging and ripping, and that's something that has always been taught in the past. And one of the things I want to ask you about is the application of wrestling arts to military training. I hear a lot of talk about how wrestling is a sport, wrestling has no purpose on the battlefield, but when I do a scan of all of the old, training manuals that I've been able to find, there is always some element of grappling in those manuals. And I wanted to get your opinion, especially now that we have things like the Modern Army Combatives program, which is based very heavily on grappling arts. What do you see as far as grappling arts in relation to being taught to military personnel?
Yeah, well, I think, I forget who, I've had so many, and I wish I could give credit to the freshman that said it to me. I've had so many military personnel, in particular guys from Special Forces, that just said, we don't do this stuff. We have guns. Well, we have knives. This is what we do. Exactly. I mean, it's seldom, I think if people have to use their unarmed self-defense in those circumstances, things have had to have gone horribly wrong. Doesn't mean not trained. It just means, all right, last base contingency there. I think where wrestling comes into play for straight, whether it's military or straight self-defense, it gives you the opportunity to find the top game position. If you're underneath, get you back up. If you're on top, you can stabilize that. Getting into your immediate crippling, we're talking the ripping and the gouging and the tearing. And I mean, we're talking ripping and gouging and tearing with education, and that education doesn't mean how do you rip and gouge and tear. And a lot of people go, stick your thumb in his eye, grab a cheek, pull a lip off. It's not rocket science, but what is the science is how to move, how to maintain, how to steamroll and pulverize from this top position. So whenever I think, this is a tiny pet peeve, and I mean, people mean well when they say this, well, I don't need to grapple because, if you got down there and, I can bite and I gouge, I can do this. I mean, that's going to make a move. Right. The thing is, when you gouge the guy who's better than you on the ground, he can also do the same things. And as soon as you do that, you up that ante, he's going to double down on the ante, and he's going to hand you your ass. It's going to be a horrible, horrible thing. It's thinking that you think a single bite or tear is going to really upset someone's really good grappler's game? No. Whenever they kick that into overdrive, you're dead. You're going to be living like shredded meat at the end of it.
Mark, one of the things that people bring up as a danger of grappling in self-defense is the use of weapons. And, I always see, people doing drills where they're grappling and all of a sudden they pull out a knife and start shanking the guy on top. And it's kind of like their way of teaching a lesson that, hey, weapons can come out of anywhere. And it's a valid point.
Yes.
But I think it's also become a little bit condescending towards the grappling arts in kind of saying, see, you can't use grappling at all against a weapon because you're going to get shanked. I personally have found that other than just standing up and running away, I'm going to rely on grappling arts to keep myself safe. I'm going to try to secure that arm and get myself, in a better position where I can try to, control or dominate that person.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, have you experimented with weapons?
You know what? That's a great question, and I think we're already of like minds on this. If we're assuming, we're talking self-defense. We're not talking thuggery. We're not saying, hey, we're going out there picking the weakest element, shoot the double leg on them and throwing them down inside the shopping mall. We're talking about you're out there and something's gone bad on you. If you wind up in the ground because someone shot on you, chances are that means, if they had a weapon to begin with, I'm puzzled as to why they weren't engaging with this in the first place. So I'm not saying it can happen that way. We could, the arrow of causality there could go a different way on it. But I think where I'm with you, it should be prevention first, mind setting, awareness, flight, get out of there if you can, then go with a designated weapon, whatever you carry, failing a designated weapon, go improvised weapon, and of course your last-ditch effort would be whatever your unarmed skills are, and the unarmed skills are only long enough to move on to something else. And I think you were correct in saying, well, we could just, a knife can come from anywhere. That's a little bit too pat. That's assuming we've gone way down this continuum, as if muggers out there just shoot in and take people down, and they go, this guy can grapple a little bit, so I will now pull my knife. It's, for the most part, from, as you will know, being well steeped in real-world confrontation, predators, they're always going to play their advantage. And if the weapon's in play, it's in play. If it comes out in the middle of a frat scuffle, that's different, because we're only supposed to be part of doing our training of true self-defense. That's what I mean by true self-defense. I don't like the idea of just, like I was defending my honor, this guy was fighting, and then a knife came out after I was scuffling with him. No, we're talking the real world stuff. I always find it a disservice to use the word self-defense when we're talking about that sort of thing. I think you and I are defining it as, hey, this woman's trying not to be raped, or these people are trapped in this nightclub, and it has hit the fan. And it shouldn't just be as if the ball, this guy's looking at me, and then out of nowhere he seems real upset because I'm staring back. That's a totally different class of what we're talking about. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not interested in the least in that sort of confrontation.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, Mark, that people use that type of drill or scenario almost as just a real quick way to dismiss grappling as a way to dismiss grappling from having any value in real-world self-defense, which I think is a big mistake. I really do.
No, I agree. I think we're on the same page with that. Anything that would allow us to dismiss that, but you can basically do that with anything. It's easy to say, but there's so much truth in it. If, let's say you have a carry permit, and you're in an open carry state, and you're allowed to carry on your hip, then we go, all right, well, let's just go to the range occasionally, and for the most part, if you're aware, everything's taken care of. There's not a lot of people, muggers out there who go, oh, yeah, they're the guy with the semi-auto on his hip. Yeah, let's do that. No, so you don't need any training. You don't need tactical folder training for that matter. If you're in that circumstance, you can always up that ante a little bit to that. I think self-defense is about true self-defense is about starting at the top of the food chain and then pursuing that razor's edge of things getting progressively worse for you down the line. And as you said, to rule out the end of what can go on is and emphasizing another portion of the spectrum just because it's your pet bias it's a bit short-sighted.
Mark, so what recommendations do you have for people that are looking to add an element of grappling to their game? What can they do to start to incorporate, training in the grappling arts? From your camp, where can they start, if they were interested in working with you?
Okay, now are we talking the self-defense end, or are we talking about the spirit of them?
Looking at grappling techniques for the purpose of self-defense.
Sure thing, gotcha. All right, well, actually, we've got, our raw, our raw curriculum. We're over 100, I think we're going to go volume 168 in October 1st. There's something we started called the Legacy Program in volume 163. If someone is either fresh or even my old guys, let's say, go to that and start there moving forward, because what we've done is taken it. It's an old idea out there. I mean, it's thousands of years old, and one of the most recent iterations of I can think of is when George Tragos was training Lou Fez. Lou Fez says in his biography, saying, while training with the man, he says, I bet I spent 3 or 4 years on the bottom. He says, he started me up at the bottom, he never let me wrestle to the top. And then the key was always start having him to learn from the bad position. Because the point from Tragos was anyone can wrestle from a good position. Learning how to wrestle from the worst position is the way to go with it. So in our Legacy Program, I don't care who anyone is when they walk in, we start everyone out with the rear naked choke. Not showing them, says, we put them in it, say, this is what a rear naked choke is, here's all the different circumstances that you can be caught with a rear naked choke, and now let's talk about how to get out of the rear naked choke. So that's, everything we do now is about teaching you grappling by how to get out of, escape, and avoid things, and then later on we start dovetailing the cool stuff about, oh, here's a submission, by the way. But first and foremost, it's back to that root element of self-defense. How good your self-defense is not going to be worth anything if you spend all your time trying to be offensive and don't know how to get out of things, and you'll never have an opportunity to slap things on. I mean, a man can know, every finishing hole in the book, but if he lacks the conditioning and or the little bit of escape artist knowledge to get out of stuff, this information is just going to waste his time. Great.
Now, Mark, I want to thank you for being on the show with us today. Talking wrestling is fun. I'm glad to get the insight from somebody that is, like I said, on the top of the list when it comes to, instructors teaching this type of material. If people want to reach out to you, oh no, yeah, everybody loves you, Mark. So,
well, that's kind.
Yes, but if people want to reach out to you, and if they want to get involved with some of the programs that you're running, come out for seminars, get involved with the DVD series, where can they reach out to you? Where can they find you on the web?
I tell you what, it's the website is www.extremeselfprotection.com. That's all one word. I wish I could say there's a good story about why it's called that. There's not. But extremeselfprotection.com is the website. That's the store. There's more information about what it is we do. But you've also got the contact there where you can get on there. Hey, drop an email or Facebook friend or messages or whatever. I mean, I have my cell phone numbers on there. As long as people don't abuse the privilege of the hours and all this, we'll chat with them and we'll see what's up. And if they've got questions, we do our best to go, hey, we're trying to figure out what each individual's goal is, because we don't start everybody at square one. We go, where are you at? What are you doing? Where do you want to go? And then we kind of point it down the line, because everyone's got different strokes for different folks.
Absolutely. Well, I recommend to the audience at home, definitely go check out Mark's material. He's been, one of the cornerstones of the modern movement to bring these arts back to the forefront of, combat martial arts, and you can't go wrong. The material is awesome. So, Mark, with that said, I want to thank you again for being on the show, and I hope to get you on in the future. We can talk some more soon.
Oh, man, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, sir.